Every few years, the world changes hands. At least, that's what we're told. New presidents take office, new parliaments form, new promises fill the air. But beneath the ceremonies, beneath the elections, beneath the flags, one question lingers like a ghost. Who really runs the world? Because while politicians come and go, the power that shapes every nation's destiny, the power to create money itself, never changes hands. That power belongs not to presidents or prime ministers, but to a small circle of unelected men and institutions, the central banks. Their names sound harmless: the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. But together, they form a hidden government of money, one that dictates interest rates, controls credit, fuels booms, and triggers recessions. This is the secret war between governments and central banks. A war fought not with armies or ballots, but with interest, inflation, and the silent weapon of debt. To understand how this war began, we have to go back to a time before central banks existed, when money meant metal, and kings still held the keys to their own treasuries. In medieval Europe, gold and silver coins were the lifeblood of every kingdom. Monarchs minted their own currency, stamped with their image. But whenever a king ran out of money, he faced a limit. His treasury was finite. Wars, castles, and armies required hard metal, not promises. The only way to raise funds was to tax citizens or borrow from wealthy merchants. That was the first battlefield of money, the struggle between rulers who wanted to spend and financiers who demanded repayment. By the 17th century, a new idea began to take shape. What if governments could outsource their power to create money to private institutions, who in return would provide limitless credit? That idea was born in England in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England. The British Crown was drowning in war debt from its conflict with France. So, a group of wealthy merchants offered a deal. They would lend the government £1.2 million, and in return, they would receive the right to issue new notes, backed not by gold, but by the government's debt itself. It was a revolution hidden inside paperwork. For the first time, money wasn't created by a sovereign ruler, but by a private bank lending to that ruler. The government owed interest to the bankers. The bankers, in turn, gained the power to issue currency. From that moment forward, debt and money became twins, and the state's power to spend was forever chained to the bank's willingness to lend. The king was no longer the master of money. He was its customer. The model spread across Europe. France, the Netherlands, Sweden, each established central banks under the same logic: to finance wars and manage debts. But it was the United States that would turn the tension between government and bankers into a century-long struggle for control. When America was born in 1776, the Founding Fathers had just lived through a painful lesson: the collapse of continental currency, paper money printed without gold to back it. By the end of the Revolution, those notes were worthless. The phrase, "not worth a continental," became a national joke. George Washington himself called paper money wicked. For the next century, Americans fought over who should control money: Congress or private bankers. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Treasury Secretary, established the first Bank of the United States, modeled after the Bank of England. It was privately owned but chartered by the government to stabilize the new republic's finances. Its critics, led by Thomas Jefferson, called it unconstitutional and dangerous, a betrayal of democratic control. Jefferson warned, "Banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." His fear was simple. If money creation ever left public hands, the republic would serve bankers, not citizens. He was right to worry. The first bank grew so powerful that Congress refused to renew its charter in 1811. But within 5 years, chaos returned: debt, inflation, and another war with Britain. So the government caved again, creating the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. Once more, private bankers gained control over national money. Once more, corruption followed. By the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson had had enough. In one of the fiercest political battles in American history, Jackson waged war on the Second Bank. He accused it of manipulating elections, bribing politicians, and enslaving the nation to debt. Jackson thundered, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And he did. In 1836, he vetoed its recharter and withdrew all federal deposits. For the first and only time, the U.S. government was debt-free. But the victory was temporary. Without a central bank, private financiers filled the vacuum. The 19th century became a roller coaster of booms and busts. Panics in 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, and 1907. Each crash destroyed small banks and enriched the biggest ones. And every time, the solution offered was the same: bring back a central bank to stabilize the system. The bankers had learned a priceless truth: chaos breeds control. In 1913, after decades of lobbying, they succeeded. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating the Federal Reserve System, a central bank that was technically public but privately controlled. The U.S. Treasury could issue bonds. The Federal Reserve could buy those bonds, creating money out of nothing. And just like that, America's monetary sovereignty quietly slipped from government hands into a hybrid creature neither fully private nor fully public. A state within a state. The official story was stability. The real story was power. Because whoever controls interest rates controls credit. Whoever controls credit controls growth. And whoever controls growth controls governments themselves. The Founding Fathers had fought to escape monarchy, only to find themselves ruled by a new kind of king, the banker. The Great Depression of the 1930s exposed the dark side of this arrangement. The Federal Reserve, instead of preventing collapse, withdrew liquidity, deepening the crisis. Banks failed by the thousands. Families lost homes and farms. Franklin Roosevelt responded by turning the system inside out. He confiscated gold, devalued the dollar, and forced the Fed under tighter Treasury control. For a brief moment, it seemed the government had won the war over money, but power never stays still. After World War II, a new system emerged at Bretton Woods, cementing the dollar's role as global reserve currency. The Federal Reserve once again became the beating heart of world finance. The Treasury set policy, but the Fed controlled the mechanism. Together, they operated like two heads of the same creature, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, always circling each other. Then came 1971, when President Nixon ended the gold standard. Overnight, money became pure credit, and credit was the Fed's domain. The last restraint was gone. From that moment, governments could spend without saving, borrow without limit, and hide inflation behind the complexity of modern finance. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet became the new treasury, infinite, invisible, and accountable to no voter. Behind the curtain, the war continued. Every president since Nixon has wrestled with the Fed's power. Ronald Reagan clashed with Paul Volcker over sky-high interest rates. Bill Clinton faced Alan Greenspan, who quietly dictated fiscal discipline from the shadows. In 2008, Ben Bernanke rescued Wall Street with trillions while Main Street burned, and not a single elected official could stop him. The Fed had become too powerful to defy. It didn't just manage the economy, it was the economy. And the conflict wasn't just American. Around the world, central banks operated as unelected sovereigns. The European Central Bank could overrule national parliaments, imposing austerity on Greece and Italy during the Eurozone crisis. The Bank of Japan could buy half its country's stock market. The People's Bank of China could print trillions while claiming to fight capitalism. Central banking had become global governance through liquidity. The irony? These institutions call themselves independent. Independent from politics, yes, but never independent from the consequences of their own power. Independence became immunity. Immunity became dominance. And governments, trapped by their own debts, became servants of the very banks they created. By 2020, the illusion shattered again. The COVID crisis gave central banks an excuse to unleash their full might. Within months, the Federal Reserve printed more money than it had in its first 100 years combined. Governments issued record debt, central banks bought it all. For the first time, the war between Treasury and Fed seemed over. They had merged into one war machine. Money was created, lent, and recycled by the same hands. But peace was an illusion. The more the Fed printed, the more inflation rose. The more inflation rose, the more the public questioned the system. Politicians blamed the Federal Reserve. The Fed blamed politicians. Each side pretended the other was in control. And the truth was simpler. Nobody was. Central banks had become prisoners of their own creation. They couldn't raise rates without crashing markets. They couldn't lower rates without igniting inflation. The global economy had become addicted to cheap money, and withdrawal could kill it. Governments, meanwhile, had lost the ability to act without borrowing. The war was no longer between Treasury and Fed. It was between both of them and reality itself. History shows what happens next. In Rome, emperors debased their currency until it collapsed. In France, the monarchy printed assignats until revolution came. In Weimar Germany, the Reichsbank printed marks until wheelbarrows couldn't carry enough to buy bread. Each time, rulers and bankers blamed each other. Each time, the people paid the price. Today, that same pattern plays out in digital form. Central banks experiment with digital currencies, promising safety and efficiency. Governments cheer them on, imagining new ways to distribute stimulus, but behind the screens, the same old war continues. Control versus freedom, secrecy versus accountability. A digital dollar or euro would give central banks not just power over money, but over behavior itself. Imagine programmable currency that expires, that can be spent only where allowed, that can track every citizen's movement through transactions. That's not stability. That's surveillance disguised as finance. So who really runs the world? Not presidents, not parliaments, not the voters who believe they choose their destiny. The real rulers are the institutions that decide what money is worth, who gets it, and who pays the price when the system breaks. They sit in boardrooms, not Congress halls. They wear suits, not crowns. Their wars leave no rubble, only inflation charts and debt records. But history whispers a warning. Every hidden empire eventually faces the light. The Church of Rome, the East India Company, the British bankers, each believed they could rule forever. Each fell when people realized the magic was an illusion. Money is no different. It is a story we tell each other about value. And the moment the story stops working, so does the empire built on it. The secret war between governments and central banks isn't over. It never will be. Because it's not just a war for power. It's a war for belief. As long as people believe in paper, in digits, in the myth of stability, the system survives. The day they stop believing, the war ends. And so does the world we know. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.